people all of a sudden realize, oh, I move differently when I think about my compact bone, or I move differently when I'm moving from the periosteum, or I move differently when I'm connecting to my organs, and I move differently if I'm thinking about my heart or if I'm thinking about my bladder. So all of a sudden you realize that how you think about things and how you connect to your kinesthetic relationship to concept changes quality.
Right.
And then you have learned in a very concrete way, which is how many dancers do learn through movement and kinesthetically, that a concept can become an action. So then you take that into choreographic training and you go, take an idea about the weather. You now know how to use your imagination to embody any idea. So what also happens after the somatics class is that their creative practices become richer. They're not just repeating steps anymore. They're not following teachers' movements. They've been able to access new methods for wrestling with conceptual expression and discourse through dance.
Knobloch's Dance presents Dance Behind the Screen, process production and social media. Hey knowers, welcome to our podcast. We are Knobloch's Dance, a social media-based company. We strive to say no to the box. We connect interdisciplinary art, technology, and artists to re-envision the process of art making and sharing.
Hello everyone, this is Yejin, your host of today's episode of Dance Behind the Screen podcast. I am currently at University of the Americas Puebla in Mexico in the office of Ray Elias Shorts. Ray Elias Shorts attended high school at the North Carolina School of the Arts, received his BFA from Virginia Commonwealth University, and his MFA from University of Texas Austin. He's the co-founder of Performantica. Ray co-founded 4 contemporary dance projects in the southern U.S., Sheep Army, the Zen Monkey Project, Steve's House Dance Collective, and THEM Them. He has been a guest artist for diverse populations in the U.S., Southeast Asia, South America, and Mexico. He has served on the faculty of the American Dance Festival, Bates Dance Festival, MELT, among others. His somatic studies include certifications in body-mind centering and the Feldenkrais method. He is a research associate at the Center of Mind-Body Movement. He is a published scholar who writes about the interface of somatic movement education and contemporary dance practice. And he served as an academic coordinator of the dance program of the University of the Americas Puebla in Mexico from 2008 to 2018. Without further ado, welcome to our podcast, Ray.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. As one of your colleagues at UTLA, I am so excited to interview you, and 2, to know more about you as a scholar, educator, and artist. So my first question is, how would you briefly describe your career?
I would say I am a movement artist and an activist who has spent about 36 years now committed to consciously developing an experiential understanding of the body. I am interested principally in supporting people in attuning themselves towards a greater clarity of intention in technical and also improvisational dancing, as well as in the practices of everyday life. My research interests lie in the dance, in movement, in body work, in the aesthetic and pedagogical implications evoked by the integration of somatic movement education and its interface with contemporary dance forms.
Nice, great. So based on your career pathway, I would like to ask more detailed questions. First, you as a coordinator and teacher in this school, UTLA, you were the head of dance program of the University of the Americas Puebla in UTLA in Mexico from 2008 to 2018, 10 years. Wow. As one of your colleagues, I mentioned, I personally appreciate all of your dedication to our dance program. How has the UTLA dance program evolved from 2008 till now 2019?
Well, I came actually in 2006, and at that time, the university was going through a series of administrative crises. There were sort of presidents that were kind of shifting pretty regularly. So when I got here, it was kind of it was a space of creative chaos. It was really very interesting. A lot of the faculty that had been here creating the dance program for the first 10 years of its existence had left. I arrived. There was another woman named Myra Morales who was here, and sort of the two of us sort of inherited this conundrum, which was, what do we do with a dance program that has existed for 10 years, but none of the people that had been guiding it were still here to teach in it. So it was a decision that we kind of looked at each other and said, okay, we can do this. And it was thrilling in a way, because there was so much chaos in the general institution that you could sort of do whatever you wanted, because people were really busy with other questions. And so we just took advantage of that opportunity to sort of lay out proposals.
All the curriculums?
Well, we still had a curriculum, but within that curriculum, we each were able to kind of go, well, I'm going to teach it this way, or we're going to invite this guest artist in, or we're going to try to make this piece in a theater or instead in a bar, or we're going to do a different kind of way of thinking about composition, or we're going to ask questions philosophically, or we used to go every week and do dancing out in the quad near what we used to call the playa, the beach, near the student center. Every week there would just be dancing for whoever was there. So there was just this incredibly vibrant space where instead of feeling like we were in a sort of highly restrictive academic curriculum, we were in this creative laboratory around higher education. And it was thrilling. And it was unsustainable also. So we were able to do it for about 2 years, and amazing things happened. And we saved the dance program from this moment of sort of critical instability.
How many students were you?
Well, at that time, it was about half of what we have now. So we had probably between 6 and 8 in a year. And now we have sometimes generations of 24. So we've grown quite a lot in terms of numbers. And we've also had at least 3 or 4 opportunities to completely reimagine the curriculum. We have now had an administration that's been stable and in place for about 11 years. So we've been working, in the kinds of things that one can work on as when you have consistency. That particular chaos is not around. That's good and bad. The program has had a chance to kind of develop and define itself through its history and time. Every year, almost without fail, people would come and see concerts and be like, oh my God, every year you guys are getting better and better and better. It's like you're just always getting cleaner and better and stronger.
They see the progression.
So people would see the progression. So I think what is different is that we have just had a chance to get clearer, to get more focused, to go deeper into creating what I would like to consider one of the 5 or 6 most progressive education programs in dance in Mexico.
Yeah, great. That was nice to hear the history of dance programming as well. Since Novox Dance Behind the Screen podcast focuses on how social media affects in dance field, I want to incorporate this idea to next questions. To talk about the changes, do you see an influence from the evolution of technology in the dance courses? I think I saw Dance for Camera course. It's one of our courses.
Yeah, it's now a required course. It was prior, it was a sort of elective. Most specifically, I'd say I've seen it in the implementation of that class. I can say I have seen it in the use of Twitter that I use as a tool for reflection and technique classes. And there was also a time when I advocated to have some video-capable tablets when they were just coming onto the market as a tool for immediate visual feedback in the technique classes. So I'll start there. I felt it was really important to complement teacher feedback with the ability for students to see themselves in some sense and not just to look at themselves sideways through a glance in the mirror. So in traditional dance training, the only time we really ever get to look at ourselves is as we're sort of passing in front of that mirror if it's a typical classroom. And people have different learning styles. So people are visual learners, they're kinesthetic learners, they're auditory learners, and teacher feedback in particular can appeal to verbal learners. And to some degree, kinesthetic learners, if the teacher is able to sort of put their hands on the students and kind of guide them through touch. But people with visual learning styles, receiving feedback through their own performance of movement from the teacher may in fact be at a disadvantage. And oftentimes the way that gets addressed is they either glance themselves through the mirror or the teacher themselves will demonstrate something that they see the student doing in order to show it to them. And that's problematic because...
In wrong way?
Well, it's not necessarily, it could be the wrong way, it could be showing the right way, but it's problematic because a teacher's body is not the student's body. And so what happens when a teacher, in my opinion, demonstrates something to show either a negative modeling or positive modeling of their practice is you're reinforcing this idea of external modeling as a way of learning dance. Now, that happens. It's a way to learn dance. But we were thinking if students could actually see themselves almost immediately, then they would be able to look at what they're doing. A teacher could point things out to them through the use of the camera. And we could also film from different angles and different orientations so that you're not only looking at yourself from that sideways glance in the mirror.
You are listening to Navox Dance.
Twitter is something that I do.
Yeah, that was my other question. I know you use Twitter for your class assignments. On your syllabus part of it, I guess they need to upload their assignments on Twitter?
Not exactly. It's not like that. So I got the idea from a study I read about the use of Twitter in a law school class. And the teacher in that class had noted that an important part of law education was to synthesize lots of complex legal arguments into something kind of digestible and knowable. They call it kind of a brief. And so Twitter has a limit on characters. It's a little bigger now than it used to be. But what he would do is he had his law students do a brief of a sort of history of a legal argument in a tweet. And what he found was that they really had to get to the essence of the argument. And students reported in the law class that it was the most interesting and also the most difficult exercise they'd ever gone through because they had to take a very complex set of legal parameters and try to figure out how to say it in 176 characters. So I used to have students write journals in technique class, and occasionally I still do it, and a lot of them would be very diligent about it. But a lot of them would also just spend the last few nights before the end of the semester filling in pages, trying to kind of comply with a homework assignment. And I'm not particularly interested in seeing that. It was kind of a useless exercise in that regard because I don't like to give homework for the sake of homework. I want writing, especially, to accompany a process, not just record it at the end. So the Twitter thing is really useful because it's something that needs to be done in the way that I apply it the same day. And also on Twitter, because it's an internet-based technology, you have a record of it. So you know if the student did it on the day that they did it. So you know if they're making things up or if they're not making things up, if they're actually responding to fresh information and fresh reflection. You can't fake a timestamp basically in social media without a lot of effort. The other thing it does is it asks students to reflect on one thing that was interesting about their class in that day. And I like the idea of minimalism in that regard because there's a lot to say about the art of elegant and minimalistic thinking. And somebody once said that people today read and write more than they ever have in history, but what they actually read and write has no depth.
That's true.
So I think there's something about Twitter which makes them write, but it makes them essentialize something in a small thought. So it's trying to find a balance between that tendency to sort of just generate lots of material, but give it a certain kind of frame and specific and say what needs to be said and be done with it rather than trying to adorn all this stuff with just flowery language. I think that's a very, very interesting challenge. I'm terrible at it, as you can see from how much I talk. But I also know how important it is to encourage people to practice it. So that's where kind of the Twitter thing came from.
So you're using that Twitter accounts for your contemporary class?
It's for technique. I use it principally for technique classes. And the idea is every day after technique class, before the end of the day, and more ideally right after class, they take a moment and think, what was something that happened that was important for me that I can say in 176 characters? And they put a tweet up. And I've got years and years of records of them. And what I do in the end is I give students back their semester. I sort of, there's these applications that can sort of download tweets. And so I go through and I separate everybody's...
like articles.
Yeah. And I separate everybody's tweets and I create little databases and I send them to the students and I say, here's your semester in a tweet version. And so it's like each day that they actually decided to tweet and sort of they can watch their process.
I also use Instagram in my technique class, especially Instagram. You can only post photo and videos. I asked them, so we talk about head-tail connection, post 1 minute video about head-tail connection. And then what I found more interesting was actually when I say post your video, they start to rehearse because you have like audience on, like unknown audience in like digital space. And they want to show the best head-tail connection video.
Well, that's cool. So that sort of is a way to kind of get them into doing. I was going to say that I think some of the things you're doing in your teaching methods class with each student doing online courses is also really interesting to me. I'm super, super intrigued by that because dance for me has always been something I'm drawn to for its organic presence. And so negotiating a dance course online has always seemed really daunting to me. In fact, we've been asked to do it here and I've always been like, no, I'm not going to do it. It's impossible. And I'm not terribly attracted to it, if I'm really honest. I'm not really attracted to the idea of learning online. And then when I think about that, I also know that's not entirely true. Because, for example, in the last few years, I've gotten really interested in Qigong. And a lot of the ways that I'm able to access Qigong is through people who do video tutorials online because there's not a lot of teachers right here. And I find it actually incredibly helpful to have someone guiding me through a process on a video.
Don't forget to say no to the box.
And also as a coordinator and full-time professor, part of our job duty is we invite guest artists and hire visiting professor, full-time professor, part-time professor. Can you talk about the selection process for deciding who the visiting professor and guest artists are? And also I'm more curious about, do you consider an artist teacher's social media presence as part of selection process? I know it's not their requirement, they have to share. But I think some company, like big company, they also check their social media.
I don't check those things out in making decisions about people. I kind of find it kind of icky that people would do that. And I know a lot of people do, and that's their business because people now live so much of their lives through social media. And social media is also such an artificially curated arrangement of life that I think it's kind of foolish to use it to make judgments about anything.
Right.
That's one of the reasons why I don't even bother because everybody's putting out what they want you to see. But when you're making hiring decisions or things like that, it's not about what you see. It's about much more complex set of variables. So deciding to hire someone based on their social media can give you a great colleague or a really terrible one. It's just not a very trustworthy medium for those kinds of things. So I always, if I can, I try to have some sense of the person by seeing them directly in front of me. That's not always possible. So usually then what I will do is I'll go from the CV, the cover letter, I'll look at student and faculty evaluations of a class video and a selection of choreography that they've sent us. If necessary, I will ask for references and I'll do possibly a personal chat with that person. It's not always necessary. Sometimes you can get information from a CV, from a teaching video, and from
then you have an interview.
A choreography, and then you might have an interview.
Let's switch our topic a little bit. You as a co-founder, could you tell us about why you started Performatica? Please.
Well, I'll tell you what Performatica is. Performatica is called the Performatica Foro Internacional de Danza Contemporánea y Artes de Movimiento, which means an international forum of contemporary dance and movement arts. And what it is a place where not only academics and artists, but sort of a wide spectrum of actors, audiences, public officials, activists, students, community, businesses, and more collaborate to make possible workshops and roundtable discussions, sometimes laboratories, performances, all of this with the goal of facilitating international and intercultural exchange of art practices, knowledge, theory, culture, as related to the discourse of bodily movement, expression, and philosophy. Now, there have been about 8 editions so far. There's one in 2007 was the first one, then 2008, 2009, 2011, 2012, 2014, 2016, and 2018. So they were every year for a couple of times. Then we went to a sort of every 2 years. There's an organizing committee that's working on one right now for 2020. And the whole thing started really with a question for me, which was, would it be possible in a field of practice as ego-driven as dance for people to come together in a fully horizontal context, one that operated with no financial or status incentives? to share current interests and ideas in dance and movement arts? And so far, the answer's been yes. And as time has gone by, it has evolved and reformulated each time in relationship to different and distinct questions. There's been questions like, how do we move from an inclusive curatorial model to one which requires selectivity? We had to do that because there was a high volume of proposals as time went by, so there were more people than we could actually. We tried in the original ones to have a non-curatorial model in which anyone who wanted to come, we would try to find a space for them. And then the demand got too high and we only had so many spaces and so much time. So we had to start figuring out, okay, how do we do that? And then how do we remove curatorial authority from the organizers, basically, in order to ensure a basic spirit of generosity and good vibes during the actual forum, which is kind of the best part about it. It's very loving and generous, generally, the experience. What would change, for example, if we required full participation instead of come and go as you wish? The first 2 or 3 editions, people could basically come for an hour or come for 2 weeks. And it was weird. And
a lot of people, and then you have...
It was hundreds of people. Yeah. And basically the experience as an organizer was, hi, how you doing? Can I help you arrive? What can I do to get you grounded? Thanks for coming. Bye. And it was literally like ping pong all the time. And so it was very dynamic. It was extremely exhausting. And we started to realize that what we wanted out of the festival was not happening. Because people would come and it would be very self-serving. They wanted a platform to perform, but they weren't necessarily engaging in the idea of the radical generosity and interchange that we were hoping to create.
It always happens, in Puebla?
It's always happened in Puebla, in Cholula, and Udla. It's always been connected to there. So we changed that to full participation instead of come and go. We had questions like, was that amazing experience just a fluke? And how do we do it again? Can we make the administration more fluid and effective? Can we have a broader balance between international and Mexican artists? How do we appeal to different age demographics in a community, from adolescents to senior citizens? Could we investigate teaching in the form of co-led laboratories? What were novel ways to consider theory beyond a paper presentation format, for example? But for me, Performatica was always about the question. It was like, no reason to do it. Nobody's making any money. Nobody's getting status. That was the key issue. And so if we take those issues out of it, and we create this kind of anti-capitalist utopia in dance.
Oh, going off of that, you mentioned this one, Performatica hosts a space for forums, workshops, roundtable discussion, and performances with the goal of facilitating international and intercultural exchanges. Can you talk about how you use social media to support this international and intercultural exchange? So I think you have Instagram and Facebook. Also, you have specific hashtags and websites as well.
So it's definitely something that depends entirely on the internet. There's no Performatica without it existing in digital space. And I say that mostly as a clearinghouse of information and a way to connect to the event and as an archive. So it's an international event. So almost all of its sort of administrative and operational functionality comes via email and the webpage. The webpage, performatica.org, was gifted to us by an old friend of mine who's a really old school programmer. I don't know if you know the term WYSIWYG, but what you see is what you get. And so there's a lot of these things, like you can now go on to any number of free web platforms, and it's kind of visually thought through, and you just kind of like choose blocks and themes, and it has templates that are already built in, and you don't even have to know anything about HTML or PHP or anything. You can just kind of visually set up your web page. Well, this guy was not that way. He is like super old. He literally wrote every single line by hand.
Wow.
And it was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my life. And then he refined it for 3 years in the earliest years of the thing. And then, it was a lot, and he did it for free. It was this like weird charity for arts in the world. And so he'd given what he wanted to give, and he was able to give, and he said, good luck. And he literally never answered another question. He said, this is okay, it's yours. I'm done. And I respect that. So, this was an incredible challenge and a great gift, because I didn't know a thing about coding or HTML or PHP or anything. And I still don't really, but I have spent so much time combing through the website and the code on that website to make the necessary updates and changes. I feel like I can at least, now I know how to look at sort of source code and decipher sort of what happens in a website. I learned web architecture and language
Web architecture.
by that process. Well, you know, web architecture is cyberspace. I was fortunate enough in graduate school in Texas to take a class in architecture in the architecture department with the man, I can't remember his name, unfortunately, right now, who actually is credited for coining the term cyberspace. And I think it's really interesting that cyberspace was named by an architect because the way that he views and the way that many people view the web, and especially coders, is you go into the web and you build websites. It's actually virtual architecture.
Oh, it's like process of.
Yeah. So once you learn how to code, what you're learning is you're actually building space.
That's interesting.
It's the cyberspace. Much of how coding operates is actually very much about architectural thinking and processes. And so what I learned by having to kind of comb through all of this code when I needed to update things is it's really very compositional. It's very geographic.
Yeah, it's like choreography process too.
It is like spatial considerations and choreography. And so that was an incredible experience. I have spent months, if not years, literally hours and hours sometimes just trying to figure out why is this not working until I could find the place where the period was in the wrong spot. So it's been amazing. And I love what Performatica is. We've had a new webmaster who's added some cool tricks to it that I am really grateful for, but I don't understand them now because the languaging has grown from 10 years ago. And she also, I think, has done some mechanistic processes that are kind of, you have to understand web coding to really understand it. So, you know, as I said to you, I'm a little bit old fashioned. I love the old code. It's the one I wrestled with for untold days and nights. And it's a kind of an amazing artifact.
You are listening to Navox Dance.
Let's switch our topics a little bit towards you as a scholar. So in your MFA thesis paper, exploring the space between the effect of somatic education and agency and ownership within the collaborative dance-making process. And that paper, Ray mentioned when somatic education and dance-making intersect, opportunities arise for reflecting on how a value system based in collaboration, dialogue, and shared ownership affects creative practice. So that's deep. Could you explain about how the thematically influenced model affects dance making?
Okay, sure. So first, let me say that somatics is a series of methodologies that started principally, as far as we can tell, late 19th century, early 20th century. They're initially kind of occidental ways of trying to heal the Cartesian split between mind and body. They were named by a philosopher named Thomas Hannon in 1972, I think, or maybe a little later. And he called them somatics based on a phenomenological philosopher named Edmund Husserl's use of the term to kind of try to understand initially what phenomenology was. So he was talking about a somatology instead of a necrology. So he was looking at the body as a first-person subjective experience as opposed to an object. And so somatics are a lot of methods that sort of use movement and imagination, and touch and voice, and to integrate sort of this notion of mind and body as separate entities and reunify them into what we would call a self. So that's kind of a little background on somatics. Things like body mind centering, Alexander technique, Feldenkrais, continuum, Aston patterning, and the list goes on and on and on and on. So I'm very interested in somatics. As I mentioned in the beginning, my main research line is the use of somatic movement education, and in particular, its relationship to contemporary dance practice. That could be technical, that could be creative process, or it could be about injury prevention, although I tend to think it's commonly thought of as injury prevention. It's not my take on it. I think dance science and medicine, which is different than somatics, is really what we're talking about when we're talking about injury prevention. Somatics for me is, in my personal use of it, much more interested in kind of philosophy, aesthetics, and creativity, and the political implications, which is where it comes down to your question. And
the creative process is really interesting.
So for me, it has a lot to do with agency. And so I find dance to be a field where in traditional models, there's a lot of ideas about authorship. It's a very 19th century idea about art and genius. So for example, we know who Martha Graham was, right? But we don't really know the names of all our dancers. And
Martha Graham Dance Company.
Martha Graham Dance Company, or this could be any number of examples. Mm-hmm. So I really find it hard to believe, for example, that Martha carved every step of her choreography out of thin air and that there was no collaboration from the dancers. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's true, but I just find it hard to believe. And I certainly know it's not true with a lot of contemporary choreographers. Even more importantly, though, her dances would not exist as artifacts without the active collaboration of living human beings performing them. Mm-hmm. So you celebrate the author, or we segregate authorship from the full community of participants in the creative act. Yeah, that tends to be that sort of 19th century romantic idea of the genius artist. And so for me, somatically influenced model of creative process speaks a little bit to the idea of collaboration. And for collaboration to occur, one needs to feel like agency is present in all of the parties. So that means instead of Martha Graham Company, we're looking at Martha Graham and every single one of the dancers and many other people that are involved in the process feel like they have agency in the experience.
Can you, talk about the term of agency?
Yeah. So agency, let me say it like this. Agency for me is something that embodiment practices of somatic movement education do a very good job of facilitating. And in the Occident, we're immersed in a culture which is really mediated by image and technologies of advertising and control. And what we learn at a very early age is not to trust our own internal sense of self. We're constantly told that who we are or what we are is not welcome, not good enough, it's damaged. And with the purchase of this or that kind of conformist behavior, or the participation in this particular experience, or if you have this kind of outfit where you'll get all this stuff, and then with these things, you'll perform the right codes for success.
Right.
And so what I like about somatics is that by going into movement, image, touch, engagement, we learn to identify and interrogate and maybe even resist those messages, because the feeling and sensing of an embodied intelligence that knows itself differently and has a set of parameters for how to live in this world of sort of boxes and social jail cells in a different way. So we can access freedom differently.
Those two questions, it's also from your papers, but I want to re-ask to you. How does somatic experience affect a choreographer practice in terms of making aesthetic choices? So I understand that how you make the collaborative spaces, non-hierarchy, but how actually choreographer use somatic practice to make that aesthetic choices?
So somatic methods in the choreographic process also reframe the process of learning technique. Yeah, because the goals change when you use somatic methods in choreographic processes. So I often quote a conversation I had with a somatics practitioner and a dance maker and a phenomenologist named Sandra Frawley, who used to work in some universities in the United States, and she's built a thing called Shin Somatics or East-West Somatics, and it's kind of an extension with some roots in Feldenkrais that she has evolved in her own life. And we had an interview once when I was working on my thesis that these quotes come from, and she said a really interesting thing. She said, if you come through the professional world of dance, you will have various experiences with choreographers who are producing their work. And they are often, but not always, more interested in the work they are producing. And the dancers are their tools and are unfortunately treated that way. So in a more classical and dualistic definition of dance, they are material. The body is the instrument. The medium is movement. And this instrumental idea of the body, that you're just playing an instrument, that these are tools, well, that kind of objectifies the person. So to believe that the medium of dance is really the human being is a little bit different than viewing the body as an instrument. And so she said that to me, and I was like, whoa, okay. So if your goals as a choreographer are to instrumentalize the dancers, by nature, the technical training that they're going to receive will be focused on being a good tool, a reliable object of labor, a loyal and capable replicant of your choreographic demands. And I would like to think that this kind of choreographer is rarer and rarer these days, especially as the world tends to embrace a wider panorama of discourses in dance. And dance language has begun to be interrogated more deeply through the lens of cultural studies, etc. And I also imagine that these people still exist. And some of the dance education that I see around me seems to be convinced that there is more than less of this dynamic out there. So when a somatically influenced choreographic process happens, one that values the agency and the unique contributions of a dancer within a process is embraced, by nature, the technical questions are going to be altered as well. So people may be encouraged to look more deeply at their own movement voices or supported in finding personal solutions for how to negotiate distinct stylistic neuromuscular challenges. Improvisation as a practice within a technical context could be emphasized more as an essential practice rather than a complementary one. Technique itself might be reconsidered as something that gives shape and expression to the whole person rather than a set of tools for executing movement within a stylistic frame. So I think the aesthetics are obviously, they come from what we do. They come from how we entrain and express and manifest our bodily beliefs and processes. And so if you're going through this kind of somatic model of creative work and choreographic process, and you're then letting that somatic model of creative work and creative process inform the nature of your quote unquote technical organization, then the aesthetics that are going to come out in those pieces are going to be by nature altered.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree.
Don't forget to say no to the box.
Can you share with our audience, so obviously our students in Udlab, they love Ray's class, how students change after they take your somatic classes?
I think what changes is that, A, they start to inhabit themselves from an internal sensory perspective more in their dancing. So it's not all about doing what the teacher demonstrated. They have so many more skills for sort of identifying points of initiation and sequencing and internal connection based on their kinesthetic and proprioceptive capacities than just trying to model an external experience. That's one thing that changes. They start to realize that they're full of possibilities, creatively, technically, that they have agency, that they begin to trust themselves in terms of how they're going about their learning and about the things that they're proposing creatively. And they also realize that one of the ways that I think somatics also affects creative process, to go sort of add on to that other question, is especially in something like experiential anatomy, you take an idea, an image of a bone or a notion, a physiological fact from science or fact theory from science, and you put it into your living self and you move it and you feel it and you exchange ideas with other people through different nonverbal mediums, or you talk about it, you color, you sing, you make voice, you dance. And what you discover through that process is how to create from a concept an actual real space-time manifestation. Feel your bones. Move your bones. Move your compact bone. Move your skin of your bone, your periosteum. Move the deep marrow of your bone. You have to image that. You have to imagine that in your mind. And then you have to start to kind of create a connection internally and kinesthetically. And people all of a sudden realize, oh, I move differently when I think about my compact bone, or I move differently when I move from the periosteum, or I move differently when I'm connecting to my organs. And I move differently if I'm thinking about my heart or if I'm thinking about my bladder. So all of a sudden you realize that how you think about things and how you connect to your kinesthetic relationship to concept changes quality.
Right.
And then you have learned in a very concrete way, which is how many dancers do learn, is through movement and kinesthetically, that a concept can become an action. So then you take that into choreographic training and you go, take an idea about the weather. You now know how to use your imagination to embody any idea. So what also happens after the somatics class is that their creative practices become richer. They're not just repeating steps anymore. They're not following teachers' movements. They've been able to access new methods for wrestling with conceptual expression and discourse through dance.
That unexpected movement quality.
Yeah.
Through the
and
practice.
that's what fascinates me about somatic work in a dance environment.
You are listening to Navox Dance.
Let's open our discussion to more social media.
Okay.
Have you seen a shift in how people consume dance with the evolution of social media?
Definitely. Screen dance, for example, is a huge medium now, which I think has only exploded with the experience of sort of the internet, with video logging sites and archival sites. And so now people can share their work.
Accessibility, yeah.
Accessibility is huge. I like to think particularly, though, that what I think happens is that now things that we used to only hear about in newspapers through sort of written criticism, you can actually now at least have a relative visual record of it. And you can hear like, what is Akram Khan doing these days? And you can go and find out. I don't live in England, nor am I in India where he's coming from.
Yeah.
But I can look on the internet and I can see what he's doing. And it's different, obviously, than being there or getting to talk to him or studying with him. But I get at least a sense of how people are doing things. And I think that's good. And I think it's terrible.
Why it's terrible?
Because we have less context now. Everything has been equalized. You know, so people have talked a lot about on the internet, what social media does basically is it creates an economy of attention. And so now what happens is, like the basic rule is if your video is more than like a minute and a half and at maximum 3 minutes, people won't watch it.
They'll just skip.
Yeah. They'll skip. And even that, if it's a minute and a half and it's not a minute and a half of like 1,000 edits and incredibly good production values and all these other kinds of things, people will probably still not watch it. And so the media itself has now started to define the content in order to kind of have people participate in the culture of attention.
Then how has social media influenced your career? Well,
it's inescapable, as we have discovered here in this conversation. And I have not fully embraced it, for sure. I was having a conversation with a colleague in Brazil recently. And she was really nice and also quite emphatically suggesting that I need a website. I don't have a website. I own the domain name to my name, but I have never built a website for it. And she was like, you need a website for your future.
Your future.
And I got it. There was a lot of kindness behind the gesture, but I'm just not there yet. So like I said, I own the domain name, but I haven't built a site for it. And I just don't really like how much the internet lets people into your world without you choosing it. So, and I'm also not convinced that one can control the narrative very effectively. I remember I had a friend who used to work with, Jason Akira Soma is a really interesting person. You should talk to him if you want to talk about technology.
Thank you.
And he is someone I went to the same college that I went to. He's done a lot of work with Netherlands Dance Theater. He's a dance person who works at the interface of a lot of analog media. And he is known for his video work and technology stuff. And he's really, really interesting. But he said once in a presentation, he said, I started to get really involved with technology because I hate technology. And he said, the thing is that if we don't begin to understand how technology works, it will control us. So the only way to resist technology is to become its master. And so he made a choice to work in those kinds of images. He used to do this thing. I don't know if it was him or it was something he was telling me about, that there was, for a brief time, there was a walk you could take through New York City. And the walk was mapped out by whoever developed the walk to be the only walk you could take in New York City where you would not be picked up by a camera. So the sort of level of invasion of privacy on a certain level, the amount of recording that was going on and vigilance that was happening now in especially urban spaces with cameras. So somebody tried to figure out, they spent all the time to figure out, if you take this specific path through a neighborhood, you will not be registered on a camera. And they would take people through that walk. And then I think after a certain point, it was no longer even possible. So I think that was kind of his example of how much we are controlled by technology, and unless you become a master of it. So I say that because I am not convinced that you can really control the narrative very effectively. So what I've tried to do is have less presence rather than a presence that I have to constantly negotiate.
Flash forward.
As we wrap up, we have our flash forward portion where we ask all our guests to answer 4 questions in a flash. Are you ready, man?
There'll be most of them, as flash as I can, yeah. We'll see.
Okay. Question 1. If you had to recommend a resource to our audience, what would it be?
Anything? Could be anything?
Yes.
Okay. I love Don Hanlon Johnson's book, Body, Spirit, and Democracy. It speaks to a lot of things that are dear to my heart. It's a sort of autobiography as it addresses his life as a Jesuit and a Rolfer and a philosopher. And kind of along the way, he really gets into a lot of issues about embodiment and cultural hegemony on thought and vertical hierarchies versus horizontal and earthly models of power and the nature of democracy. And it's one of these books that, along with really appreciating what he said, made me fly off on lots of relational tangents in my own thinking. And so a dialogue was produced that really inspired me. And I would also say that in terms of dance, not just a book, I'm really interested in the things that Crystal Pite is working on in some of her most recent works.
Lovely.
She seems to be seeking kind of a unique use of multiple dance sensibilities in order to construct dramaturgically rich scenic worlds that for me are really gut-kicking in their potency and also never lacking for physical power. And for me, contain kind of overwhelming moments of sublime beauty that just stop time for me and make me kind of gasp with appreciation. And what I also like about her is that she seems to work really hard and the people she works with are really participating in their work. It's clear to me that a single mind can't conceive of the complexities that are happening in her work, that it has to be collaborative, and that she also seems interested in something that's kind of deeper than form.
That's what we talked about. Yeah.
So I can just say that for me at this time in her life, in my life, and maybe her life too, it's just really deeply human. And there are things, both these people have digital resources where you can find information. Dawn Hanlon has a website, dawnhanlonjohnson.com, I believe it is. And obviously Crystal Pite, she's all over the place. They have interviews. There's bits and pieces available on YouTube. I don't know about following them, for example, but then that whole idea of following something is just completely weird to me because why would we follow anybody? Isn't that illegal?
Isn't that illegal? That's a good point. So just check out the resources. Cool, thanks for sharing. Question 2, what was the first dance you saw? I can't wait to hear.
Probably the first dances I saw were Israeli folk dances. My father was a big fan, and he taught all the kids in my synagogue community those dances as part of our education in Jewish culture. And what I remember being excited about it was kind of the twining steps, the circles, the upturned arms, a sense of a group that the dances provided.
Do you think social media has a positive influence on the dance world? Yes or no?
Both.
You want to add?
No.
No. Last question. What is your favorite social media platform?
I don't really like any of them. But I'm most familiar with Facebook.
Yes.
And I've used Twitter for the assignments that we've talked about.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Ray, having me in your office and for sharing your thoughts with our audience.
My pleasure.
Can you, before we go, can you please share with our listeners your social media handles, websites? Social media handles, so they can kind of stay connected with you.
If anybody, well, since
I'm not
going to accept anybody that I haven't met.
Yeah.
So I would just say, first thing you probably want to do is you'd want to try to look for me on Facebook at Ray. I don't even know how you do it, but look for my name.
Yeah.
There's not too many people. Ray Schwartz, and there's a picture of a dog. With a turban, with their face on a computer on it. That's me.
Performatica website.
You could check out Performatica, certainly. It's not necessarily a way to connect to me, but it is a way to connect to something that I've done. You can check out our blog of the dance program if you're interested in the dance program. blog.udlap.mx. Sorry, that's Spanish. blog.udlap.mx/danza.
Thank you so much, Ray.
Thanks for taking your time to tune into Dance Behind the Screen, a bi-monthly interview series where we go behind the screen to question process, product, and social media. Be sure to follow us on social media at KNOW Box Dance. See you next time and don't forget to say no to the box.